The Religious Affections by Jonathan Edwards is one of the most clarifying treatises on revival and spiritual transformation. For that reason, it has been a major influence in WordPartners' understanding of what true spiritual transformation is. We thought it would be helpful to discuss the Religious Affections with Dr. Josh Moody, an expert on Jonathan Edwards and the senior pastor at College Church in Wheaton, Illinois. We hope you enjoy. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Moody.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's jump right in and talk about the Religious Affections by Jonathan Edwards. This book came out of a historical situation, came out of Edwards' own experience and his own pastoral ministry. And it's part of a larger corpus of literature he wrote on the same subject of revival and true spiritual transformation. So can you explain to us what was happening at the time and what caused Edwards to write the Religious Affections?
Right, so Edwards was at the heart of something called the Great Awakening, which was an international movement of revival. And there was a preacher called George Whitefield who was prominent at that time, having a massive effect. I mean, thousands and thousands of people were crammed to hear Whitefield preach in the fields. They'd run. We got eyewitness testimonies of people kind of dropping the plow on the field, as it were, and jumping across hedge and ditch, cramming into field to hear him. We've got eyewitness testimonies from Benjamin Franklin describing what with the electricity in the air when Whitefield was preaching. Whitefield was obviously a dramatic, gifted, charismatic preacher, but it was more than simply his personality. We have other records of Whitefield's sermons literally being read without him present, and revival breaking out. So something extraordinary was going on in America and in England, and Whitefield was at the heart of that. Also a man called John Charles Wesley, and Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards and his church in Northampton had a series of awakenings on a not a massive scale, but on a more local scale. And then Whitefield came along, and those awakenings took on a huge scale across New England. And a lot of things began to happen that were scary for some of the traditionalists, preaching outside of church, physical manifestations. So people became so overcome with emotion, they started to fall down, cry out in the middle of sermons. I mean, Edwards' most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was actually never completed because at least the second time he preached it once in Northampton, and again in the place where the most famous impact occurred. It was never completed in that church because the outcry from the people listening was so massive that he just couldn't be heard anymore, and the pastors who were with him had to get down, among the congregation, pray for people as they're coming to Christ, coming to faith. And so this is all, exciting sort of thing that pastors want to happen. But on the other hand, it created sort of fears among the traditionalists, but also people perhaps going a little too far. And so you got a split of the movement between the sort of radical new lights and then the old lights, as they're called, the kind of extremists for the revival and those who are very much against the revival. And Edwards carved out a space for what were historians would call the moderate new lights, those who are for the revival, but also wanting to say, keep God's word at the heart, keep biblical orthodoxy at the heart, not run to an extreme. And so Edwards wrote a number of different things to try and both promote the revival and describe it. And his most mature reflection on that is called the book we're talking about, Religious Affections. There are others previous to that, distinguishing marks, some thoughts concerning the present revival of religion were written earlier, but the Religious Affections is his sort of mature, more seasoned reflection on revival. So now, as we look back, it's really the classic textbook. If you want to understand revival, it's the best book written in church history on that. But it's also, if you want to get a grasp for how you discern what God is doing and what real experience of God is and what it is not, that's the book to go for. So I often say, to young pastors, if you want a really good handbook for pastoral ministry, Religious Affections isn't a bad place to go. Not because at the technical, practical level, but at the mental, conceptual, spiritual. How do I understand what is a real work of God? How do I promote that? And what is not a real work of God? And so that gives real work of God. That gives some of the context, also some of its contribution to current ministry.
And for that same reason, The Religious Affections is a core book for our training and philosophy of ministry, really.
Right.
We want true spiritual transformation in the lives of people through the Word of God, by the Spirit.
Yeah.
So it's helpful to know signs of when that is taking place and things that don't necessarily mean that's taking place.
Right.
Our culture doesn't seem to use the term affections much. How does Edwards use the term, and how does it differ from emotions?
That's a great question. It's actually an area of some debate among Christians who read Edwards. The popular understanding of Edwards' use of affections is that it is for all intents and purposes, basically the same as emotions, right? That's almost certainly incorrect. Because of the history. So in church history, there's this distinction between passions, which tend to be more like physical, almost sensual reactions to things. Not necessarily bad, I mean, but just the way the body emotes things. It's just what it is. And then there's a sort of higher order of, for want of a better term for the moment, emotions, which tend to be accorded things that use words like affections in relation to that. And so that's the background, and it's particularly picked up by the Puritans and then developed more by Edwards. So what I think Edwards is saying by affections are the thinking, the feeling, and the willing expression of the human heart, what you have affect towards. Not we use affect as in pretense, but the word is literally a sort of what you're actually doing. And so it's an internal will, feeling, understanding, movement in a certain direction, a movement in a certain direction. And it's cognitive, not emotions we think of as non-cognitive. No, it's cognitive, but it has a movement inside. And that's what affections are. Another term that Edwards uses for this sometimes, or this kind of area, is the sense of the heart. So you have a taste. The famous description Edwards uses is about honey. So he would say that when someone has a taste for God, their affections are stirred by God, it's as different as when someone has heard about honey as to when someone has actually tasted honey. And when you have an affection for God, then you've tasted honey. There's that sense, that feeling, for sure, but not in a sort of crazy passion way, if that makes sense.
And according to Edwards, one element of affections are what you alluded to, is that they lead to action. Can you explain the relationship between affection and action?
Yeah, so what I have a will to do is what I will do. Now, there can be physical constraints, right? So you can imagine someone who's in jail has a will to be free, but they're in jail. Okay, but leave aside physical constraints. What I have a will to do is what I will do. And affections are what I've decided mentally in my mind, sense is true, and have a will, therefore, to do. So that inevitably leads to action. Otherwise, I don't have the affection for it. Now, I can be physically constrained. And maybe taking it out of the 18th century, there may be sort of psychological counseling kind of things that can constrain you. So you can have a will to do something, but you can be constrained by other kind of background things or things that's happened in your life. But take aside those sort of more, kind of counseling room complexities, and certainly the physical constraints. What I have a will to do is what I will do. And therefore, if I've been moved intellectually, emotionally, cognitively in my will to do something, then I'm going to do it. Otherwise, I'm not going to do it. It's what Jesus says, the one who loves me obeys my commands.
In The Religious Affections, Edwards works through 12 non-signs, things that don't necessarily prove a true spiritual experience one way or another, and 12 signs. From this list, Dr. Moody, what are some of the biggest takeaways for today?
Well, I think actually reading through the non-signs is almost as important as reading through what the signs are. And the reason for that is they did then, and we do today, we tend to make things significant, or signs, that are not really significant. The most obvious, I think, is the sort of physical manifestation. So we tend to think that if someone hears a sermon or sings a song and they start really crying, then they must mean it. Well, maybe not. People cry in all sorts of situations. Or we think, that's a kind of sad emotion, but if someone is singing a song or listening to a sermon, they're really enthusiastic. They start jumping up and down, they start clapping, they go, yeah, you think they must mean that. Well, maybe, but people do the same kind of thing at rock concerts or at a party or something. It does. In other words, because we are psychosomatic wholes as people, that is, we have bodies, and the bodies are connected to our thinking and feeling, humans act in certain ways when they are powerfully moved. It doesn't necessarily mean, it's not necessarily a sign that the thing by which they are powerfully moved is the work of the Spirit. All it's really showing is that we're human, we're physical. Similarly, other people, of course, tend to look at someone getting very enthusiastic and excited at a meeting or something and think, well, that certainly isn't the work of God. We should be reverent, we should be staid, keep quiet. But again, that's a confusion. Some of that's cultural. Certain cultures are more expressive. Some of that's just physical. People, we're physical bodies, so we express ourselves in certain kind of ways. You see it in the Psalms. You kneel, you stand, you clap, you raise your hands or worship. These are just physical ways of the human body expressing their natural response to things. But it doesn't. But the same natural responses to things you can see in other situations that are completely non-spiritual. Parties, rock concerts, whatever, a family get together. I'm so excited. So in other words, it's not a sign that this is a work of God. It's a sign that there's a human involved in something. Something moving is happening. But you don't know what, just by looking at the outside signs. I think that's really important to get clear. People are constantly confused by that all the time in church life. So that's on the negative side. On the positive side, I think it's really, really important to get clear in our minds, really the uppermost, or the greatest sign, which is love, where Edwards lands. And clearly that's biblical. The greatest of these is love. These three shall remain, but the greatest of these is love. The first fruit of the Spirit is love, not just because it's the first randomly, and not just because it's the first in priority order, but because it's the summation of all the rest. Edwards has this phrase, concatenation of fruit. That is, the fruit is actually interlocking, connected, and it's summed. Summation is love, and so, and Edwards defines this love as a humble, serving love. So there's a kind of love which can be almost prideful. I'm loving and I'm so proud about that. But Edwards defines this love as a humble, serving love. So on the what I think is most important about the list is this general overview. First, get really clear on what is negative. What are the negative signs? What don't mean anything? And the other piece then is to land on the primary one, which is when we see the love of God going forwards, then we're seeing what is truly the work of God. In other words, the devil will not want to make humans love Jesus and love his people. And there is no natural way, given who we are, because we're in sin outside of Christ, there's no natural way to make anyone love Jesus and his people. So when you see that developing, you are surely seeing the work of God. And so that's how I'd summarize it.
When talking about the religious affections, it's probably good to note to people that it's not the easiest book to read. It's probably at least 350 pages, and Edwards kind of has a roundabout way sometimes of explaining his points. And Sam Storms, who wrote a book interpreting the religious affections, says, "I've worked my way through the affections at least 10 times, and I still struggle in places to make sense of him." So that's encouraging to me. That being said, what are some resources that you would recommend to help people more deeply engage Edwards in religious affections?
Yeah, I think it's, I don't know whether it's Edwards, it's just and part of it is Edwards. It's like trying to understand Mozart. He's a genius. It takes time to try and figure it out. Part of it's just 18th century English. The sentences are really long. So we're used to sentences, just having maybe 7 or 8 words in them, and you come across a sentence that has 30 or something. You just don't know what to do. So you have to get used to reading long sentences. I think probably the most helpful thing to do, we're talking about religious affections because it's a great book, but if you really want to read it, you probably should start somewhere. I think the Distinguishing Marks is an easier read, and if you read the Distinguishing Marks, then you kind of have the key to understanding the religious affections, which is sort of the Distinguishing Marks writ large. That's an easier book. The other thing to do would be to read something like some of Edwards's personal narrative, which is almost really his description of how he became a Christian. And you read that, you get a sense of his heart. I have to say, I've never, maybe this is not encouraging, but I've never really found the religious affections hard. I find some books hard going, like Wittgenstein's pretty hard going, and some novels are pretty hard going. Some are great. But I haven't found. But I think because you just have to. My main piece of advice would be take it slowly. Mm-hmm. Get a copy, print it off, or look at it online, and just read it slowly. I read the religious affections first when I was on the mission field in the Republic of Georgia. And I took with me 2 volumes of Edwards in my backpack. It was just right after the Civil War there. There was, I wasn't sitting in any kind of posh library or anything. I was, the electricity didn't always work. And, so in my mind, reading this isn't associated with sort of really effete, high-end intellectualism. It's associated with cutting-edge, slightly dangerous ministry, which is kind of where Edwards was. He was frontier land. There was quite a lot of danger around him, actually. And so I would take it slowly, not be scared. I've never found, I would actually read the text itself. I love Sam Storms, love what he's done. But if you can actually read the text itself, it's a bit like reading the Bible. I've written a commentary on the Bible, so in a sense I'm all for commentaries. But the best way to understand the Bible is to read it, and to have the confidence that when you read it and use your own brain and pray about it, you understand more about the Bible. And sort of, I think that's true of almost anything. You actually go to the source, figure out some of it out for yourself. Then if you get stuck, then go to the helps. I've written books on Edwards, so, by all means read those too. But you really want to go to the source and then lean on the interpreters afterwards. Otherwise, you spend all your life looking at life through someone else's stained glass windows rather than actually going and experiencing yourself.
This audio recording is a production of WordPartners, a ministry dedicated to elevating God's life-giving word in the hearts, lives, and ministries of pastors and their people. Learn more about our ministry at wordpartners.org.